God whose word I praise, in the Lord whose word I praise, in God alone I trust, I will not be afraid. What can mortal man do to me?
All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome back to Preterist Apologetics. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute. And just above me here is Mike Sullivan. And you'll probably notice that I'm in a completely different venue. I'm not in my office. And when I came on into the studio, Mike goes, "Where are you?" I happen to be in Duncan, Oklahoma, which is about 85 miles from Ardmore. And I'm at an automotive swap meet. As most of you who watch my morning musings know, I'm a gearhead, I'm a car nut, and I'm a picker. And so I love to go to the swap meets. I like to buy parts and resell them, and I like to look for cars to fix up and that type of thing. So this is a really good break from all of the intensity of my preparation for my debate with Chris Date, which, as it turns out, I didn't need to prepare that hard anyway. So,
Yes.
so anyway, it's good to be here this evening.
Well, good to have you, even though you're somewhere else. And
The wonders of technology, Mike.
yeah. So just some thoughts on the debate off the top of my head. As I shared with you off air, you're just not having good providence when it comes to getting good quality debates on Donnie's show. Anthony Aquino I thought that was a train wreck on Anthony's part, just as far as debate in general. He had like one point that's all he talked about. Well, you can't reduce 1,000 years. And of course, you heard that in Chris's thing as well. But that's all Anthony had throughout. I don't know how long that debate was, but that was it.
It was 3 hours.
Wouldn't answer any of your arguments. And then we have Chris come on, and a lot of people who know him expected some things of him. And what disturbed me the most, Don, was he had a meme. Okay.
Oh.
This was a pre-prepared meme to a response to your affirmative arguments that he didn't know, but he had that as a response to your opening arguments. So that tells me right away, this guy was immature, he was childish, and he set in his heart and in his mind, I am not going to respond to the analogy of faith connected with the time text. I'm not going to go there. That was his word. Those were his words.
Those were his words.
And, all you did, I've got The Right Doctrine from the Wrong Text, essays on the use of the Old Testament and the New Testament, G.K. Beale. The Conversation of the Imagination, Paul as Interpreter of Israel Scriptured by Richard Hayes. And this is my favorite and one you use and pastors use all over America and the world, Chris. Commentary on the New Testament use of the Old Testament by G.K. Beale.
Massive work, wonderful work.
Now, there was nothing you did that was, I'm going to get this passage over here that's not related to passage over here. All of your passages were connected. If Paul is quoting Old Testament passages, it is exposition 101, hermeneutics 101, to find out where it's used in the Old Testament and to see what the author's relationship, what he's trying to develop of that Old Testament, which you were doing, which you were challenging him on, and he didn't want to go there.
I mean, after all, you're just bringing passage after passage after passage after passage from here and there and everywhere. And that animation, and you and I said this just off of air, came directly from Sam Frost. And anyone who has watched Sam Frost, and my debate with him on the Chris Arnson show knows. I mean, there are some arguments that Chris Nate made that were almost verbatim out of Sam Frost narrative on the Chris Arnson show.
Sam has schmooed so many people into thinking I am the guy. You have to come to me. And they've fallen for it, and they do, and this is what happens.
That's exactly what happens. You know, when you have a man in a debate, just as you say, he had this pre-prepared meme, which had no significance, had no meaning, and most of all, no application to
Right.
anything that I said. It was not relevant to anything that I said.
It was
And
insulting and immature, number one. And when I brought it up in the debate in the chat, I said, Donnie, he keeps posting this meme. And he said, oh, I don't see it. Well, Donnie, because you're so concerned about how much money you're getting in your super chat questions, that's all your eyes are looking at, and you're not moderating the debate.
yeah.
And that irritated me to no end. That and his constant interrupting and his hogging of the time was atrocious. And you were about as gentleman as could be. I mean, I was talking to Zach, and we both were like, we would have lost it on this guy. I mean, I don't know how you stayed cool, man.
Well, you know, I watched the a review and comments by Zach. He did a fantastic review of it, and you know, he was saying what you just said.
Yeah.
The way Chris Date acted, the way he spoke was really without excuse. He was condescending. He was arrogant. You could tell on many occasions, or at least I would say this. I felt this way, and boy, I have read a ton of comments in the post debate postings on Donnie's website, and person after person after person said he was purposely trying to provoke Don,
Yeah.
trying to get him to lose it.
Yeah.
Now, I pride myself, and I don't mean that arrogantly by any means, but it's been my experience down through the years that when you have a debate opponent who ignores everything, every exegetical argument that you offer, they ignore every syllogism that you offer, they ignore every substantive statement that you make, and they purposely use statements like, this is absurd, this is ridiculous.
Yeah, they're trying to compensate for their lack of exegetical logical argumentation or lack thereof by getting animated and getting the listener like, ooh, he must be making a point because he's angry. Or
Yeah.
then after a while, you're like, no, he's just getting angry because he's got no arguments.
Well, and that to me was very evident. I mean, I felt like, and of course, I had sent you a copy of my opening presentation. It's funny, by the way. It's not funny because as I was going through it, I was going, this was not my final presentation. For some reason, StreamYard did not draw up my final form, in which I had added, Isaiah chapter 27, which is a key text, obviously. And so I had to bring it up independently of my opening statement. But as I started to say, I sent you a copy of my opening. I sent one to William, and I felt like my opening statement, and I even told my wife, if I were in Chris's position and I heard that opening statement, I would want to fold my tents and go home.
Yeah.
Because it literally, in my estimation, left him without any response whatsoever.
Yeah. So let's just look at this. So the proposition is on the resurrection, correct? Resurrection of the dead. So you want to address where the resurrection of the dead is mentioned in the Old Testament: Isaiah, Hosea, Daniel. Okay. But somehow these passages are just over here and over there, and it's got nothing to do with anything. That's all you're doing is you're bringing up Old Testament passages that everyone and their grandma knows is dealing with the resurrection of the dead.
The same
And
resurrection.
yeah, and you're showing how the New Testament authors are developing it. Now, Chris is fine to say, well, maybe here in this Old Testament passage, it is a corporate, it is a spiritual death, it is a covenantal death. But I think, based upon the context, the Greek or whatever, how Paul is using it, he's using it differently than this okay, Chris, now the burden of proof is upon you to show us why, because we make the harmony between the two a lot better than you do, and let us show you why. But Chris didn't even enter the debate intellectually, logically, exegetically at all on any of these points.
Well, and we can go through them here, and we can go through them in a little bit more fuller detail. But I'll just very quickly list for those who are watching and listening. I developed Isaiah 25, Isaiah 26, and I mentioned after my opening presentation, Isaiah 27, Daniel chapter 12, Hosea chapter 13. And I made the point no less than 13 times in response to Chris's claim that, oh, these are all unrelated. They're just unrelated. And I pointed out, again, no less than 3 times, every single one of those texts mentions death, and they identify the death that is the subject, and it's not biological death. Number 2, they mention the Great Tribulation. And number 3, the salvation of Israel. And number 4, every single one of them posit those events at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And yet Chris literally, now folks, we're not exaggerating. If you haven't watched the debate, I encourage you to do so. Chris never went a single time to Isaiah 25, Isaiah 26, Daniel 12, Hosea 13, not to one single one of them, like Mike was saying. He didn't go there and say, now, I can understand where Don would make this application, but here's where the application is wrong. Let me demonstrate that from the text and from the New Testament application. Instead, he made the same argument over and over. They're unrelated. Well, right. If Paul, the inspired apostle, cited Isaiah 25, and if he cited Isaiah 26, and he also quoted from Isaiah 27, and if he quoted from Hosea 13, and if he drew from Daniel chapter 12, the same apostle drew from every single one of those passages, then how are they unrelated? So Chris was just simply making a bold, unsubstantiated claim for which he gave not one single word of evidence. Exactly. He just said, well, they're just this passage unrelated and the unrelated. Well, again, if the single apostle Paul appealed to every one of those texts to talk about his doctrine of the resurrection, then they're not unrelated.
Right. And, getting back to kind of Hayes and the scholarship of, when a New Testament author quotes an Old Testament passage, you have to find the continuity or discontinuity. You have to realize, is this a direct fulfillment or is it a typological fulfillment?
Right.
And what's type and what's anti-type, and how are they coming together? And again, that's just a debate that Chris is unwilling to really have. And you could tell he didn't study. He's got a strike against him either way. He either studied your books, knew that's where you were going, didn't know how to deal with it, so he thought he was going to respond with a meme, or he just didn't do his homework. But I think he did his homework, saw the train coming, and thought he was just going to be sarcastic, and got some of his buddies, Sam, and that echo chamber of backslapping just made him feel good about himself in this approach. But it completely backfired.
Yeah, as I said to you off air just before we came on air, I understand that the great majority of the comments that I read on Donnie Budinsky's website most of the comments were by preterists. The most of the comments that I saw, I should say that. And I haven't been on there uh, at all, hardly at all, because I've been here at the swap meet and kind of get letting my mind, freewheel and rest and recuperate and what have you. So I've barely, I'll be honest with you, I have barely been on the internet. I posted my my morning musings this morning about 4 o'clock. I actually slept to almost 4 o'clock this morning. I was so tired, and I was like, "Man, you become a sluggard sleeping till 4 o'clock." you know. But other than the time that I took to post my video, on I don't know 2022 Facebook pages, I shut the internet down and I read a few little car articles and looked for some parts and this and that and the other. And other than that, I haven't been on the internet enough to even talk about. And I had somebody send me a text today and said, "Are you aware of some of the comments being made by Anthony Aquino?" Well, I'm not at all surprised. I could almost quote without reading anything that he might have posted. I could almost tell you exactly what he was going to say. Had something to do with a thousand. What does a thousand mean? And
Well, like literally 3 seconds before you mentioned Anthony Aquino, Deb writes, Anthony Aquino and Sam Frost were extremely childish. Well,
well,
newsflash there. Then Zach says, go through what would have happened if Chris played along and why he was cornered as a partial preterist.
yeah.
And but you notice, Zach, as you know, and Don, he didn't really want to sit in the seat as a legitimate partial preterist. Because here, let me read this from Gentry, because actually, this is a really good segue into what I thought of Chris's approach was. My debate opponent in this book was Keith Matheson, who is a legitimate partial preterist, okay? And Keith's chapter was, even though I believe this about the time text, who Babylon is, all of that, my approach is going to be, I'm going to throw everything at the wall and hope something sticks, even if it's stuff I don't even believe and I don't even defend in my other books. Okay.
Amen.
And that was basically Chris's approach.
It was.
He really didn't want to commit himself to anything. And I think you did a good job of pulling that out on him. And it's just like, this hypothetical. But on double fulfillments, let me read you what Kenneth Gentry writes. Now, when Kenneth Gentry is debating dispensationalists who double fulfill everything, and even some amillennialists.
Yes.
Okay.
Kim Riddlebarger being one of them.
Yeah, which is interesting. This is what Gentry says about double fulfillments when he's debating other people in the book of Revelation. He says, it's pure theological assertion that has, quote unquote, no exegetical warrant. Now, to show you how these guys deviate from their stated view, just like Don said, if you were debating a dispensationalist and he started double fulfilling everything, Chris, you would get irate and you would just call foul and you would say this is a joke, right? Well, Gentry says that, but when you were interacting with him at the Criswell conference on the millennium, I got up and asked a question and said, basically, well, now that you're taking Daniel 12, the resurrection of Daniel 12 as fulfilled in AD 70, and in his Facebook post, he said it has nothing to do with a physical, biological resurrection.
Right.
Gentry changed course and said, well, there's a spiritual fulfillment in AD 70 of the resurrection, but there will be an ultimate physical resurrection.
Man. hang on just a second.
Okay.
Yeah. Can you turn the lights back on, please? Yeah, I'm doing a radio program. Thank you.
So that's a clear example of, I'm going to debate this way when I'm debating a futurist, but if I'm debating a preterist, I'm going to get rid of all of my arguments, my hermeneutical approach. And to me, that is like super telling.
Well, it's extremely revealing. And I had the following comment on the tip of my tongue, and then something that Chris said tripped me over into saying something else. But I had on the tip of my tongue, the dispensationalists are absolutely falling in love with Chris Date tonight. And that is absolutely true. And Chris Date knows it because Chris Date, number one, tells us in the debate with me, well, statements are just really, really difficult. They're hard to understand. Now, nature statements are, oh boy, they're easy. They're simple. But time statements are really difficult. You have to labor, you have to struggle to understand what the time statements mean. And then, well, yeah, AD 70 was typological. Well, guess what? Those are dispensational arguments. Dispensationalists, and of course, if you remember, Mike, after he had gone over dual fulfillment, I challenged him and I got not one single word of response. Well, if you're going to argue for double fulfillment, what about triple? What about quadruple? How many fulfillments might there possibly be?
Right.
And of course, he didn't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole. And of course, there's another element of this, and I developed this in my book on Daniel 12, as well as in my book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, the Wedding of the King of Kings, is that when you talk about and with partial preterists, what do? Well, you have not Kim Riddlebarger, but Jim Jordan, very noted Reformed amillennialist. He says it is perversity. That's his word, to suggest that there will yet be another great tribulation. Mm-hmm. Jesus is very clear. It was in the first century.
Yeah.
Well, so
and
here you have
same with Gentry.
Absolutely. So here you have two leading partial preterists. And yet, what does Chris Date say? I don't have a problem in the world saying that there might be another yet future great tribulation.
Yeah.
And who knows what else? And I didn't have time to develop this, as you well know, Mike, there's never, ever, ever enough time in a debate to say everything you want to say and everything that you need to say. But when he was talking about the dual fulfillment, I'm off to the side and I'm thinking, okay, let's see how far he'll carry this. Because in Revelation 21, what do we have? We have a wedding. Well, was that in AD 70? Like Kenneth Gentry in his massive two-volume book will argue, and in his book, Navigating the Book of Revelation, Kenneth Gentry says, despite initial appearances, Revelation 21 and 22 are not about the consummated, the climax of history. It all came to pass in AD 70, and the old covenant bride was fully supplanted by the new covenant bride in AD 70. Well, I wonder why Chris Date wouldn't take the same position. He argued himself into that corner.
Yeah. He sees
so would he argue? Yeah, would he argue like Kenneth Gentry?
Well, on the topic of double fulfillment, I don't know if you saw Doug Wilson's latest thing. Okay, yeah. Well, when pressed on 2 Peter 3 and Revelation 21 and 22, Doug was claiming that, well, maybe there is a double fulfillment of the new creation. And yet that's not what he says in his commentary on the book of Revelation.
It absolutely
at all
is on the not.
Creation. And if you read John Lightfoot and you read John Owen on 2 Peter 3, I capitalize it, I bold it, I underline it when I quote it. They say these elements of the first heaven and earth, they say they are only, that word only referring to the elements of the old covenant world. they're not typological of anything else. There's not a double fulfillment of this kind of element with a different kind of element. And so it's interesting how partial preterists, when they're pressed, they just run to the hermeneutic of their futurist opponents that they say is non-valid.
Well, another really good example of that is Joel McDermott. Joel McDermott, when he was dealing with dispensationalists, just he was merciless in his critique and castigation of the dispensationalists. But what did McDermott want to do with Revelation, or excuse me, with the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15? Well, I could certainly agree that it had a first century fulfillment, but we're waiting for the final fulfillment.
Yeah.
What's that? Dual fulfillment. So I felt that I have very honest, and I should have used my favorite term, argumentum ad desperatum, but I felt that appeal to double fulfillment was, and believe me, I felt like there were many super weak points that Chris tried to make. I felt that was one of his most desperate points.
Well, the Old Testament does have typological fulfillments, but to claim that just because the Old Testament has typological fulfillments doesn't mean that the New Testament does, because the New Testament is telling you that the New Testament is the fulfillment of all of those Old Testament typological fulfillments.
The time, the kairos had come.
Right. How many appointed times of these Old Testament prophecies are there going to be? Yeah. There's nothing in Daniel 12 that says there's two ends. There's nothing in Revelation.
I even challenged him on that.
Yeah.
If you remember, I made the point on Daniel chapter 12, verse 7, when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, all, not some, as I said, not even most, but all of these things shall be fulfilled. And I said, it doesn't say and become types of something else. And of course, he said, well, I feel perfectly comfortable making a typological application to a yet future period of time. Well, you may feel comfortable with that, but it doesn't mean it has any validity to it. Yeah. And that's the whole point of the debate. And so, Mike, why don't we begin to take a look? I found it very telling. And again, I understand. Let's go up to the first two on there. Okay. Yeah, there you go. Go back to the previous one, number 2. Yeah. Oh, no. Let's go down to number 3. Okay. Folks, I want you to notice something here, what I did. All throughout the debate, all throughout my opening presentation, I gave comments taken directly from either Chris Date's debate with Michael Miano, or I had sent him a list of 15 questions, and I used his written responses. Now, I want to deviate here for just a moment. I thought it was extremely telling, and it was really disturbing. I pointed out that in response to one of my questions, I've forgotten which one it was, 6 or 7 numbers, something like that, I asked Chris Date, please specifically define as distinctly as possible what is the law that was the strength of sin that Paul referred to in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 55, and 56. Yeah. Chris Date never hedged, he never equivocated. Is my present understanding that was the law of Moses?
Well, he did not run that by Sam Frost, I don't think.
He sure didn't. Yeah,
and I think if Sam saw that afterwards, he goes, "Oh, you're in trouble there. Yeah, I just wouldn't even answer this," which he did.
That's right. Yeah, but he answered it. He answered it unequivocally. He answered it very succinctly.
In the debate, he didn't answer the ramifications of that.
No, he didn't. Matter of fact, he denied. But this is where he tried to divert and to deflect. Late in that debate, after I had brought up the argument, Paul said the resurrection would be when the law that was the strength of sin would be overcome. The law that was the strength of sin was the law of Moses. Chris Date agrees. Therefore, the resurrection would be at the end of the law of Moses. And Chris Date, if you go, folks, if you watch it, you'll notice down toward the close of the debate, as I remember it, he said, I never said the resurrection would be in AD 70. I never said that he did.
Right.
You see, he's deflecting and trying to implicitly say that I was misrepresenting him.
Right. Right.
All that I did was to say the resurrection would be at the end of the law that was the strength of sin. Well, he agrees with that. But the law that was the strength of sin was the law of Moses, Chris date. That was his own words, but he was entrapped by his own words. So he tries to flip the script and say, I never said the resurrection was in AD 70 or something to that effect, trying to deny the very thing that he had admitted or the force and the logic of what he had admitted.
Right.
And I mean, it was just that type of thing. And if you remember, folks, I think I appealed to this one of the arguments that I made 2 or 3 times, and that was on Daniel chapter 9. 70 weeks are determined to put away sin. The resurrection is the time when Israel's sin would be put away. Chris date. Yeah, previous chart. There you go. There you go. My positional statement was the taking away of Israel's sin is posited at the second coming of Christ and the resurrection. Romans 11:25-27, 1 Corinthians 15. Chris date agrees. I mean, he's on record. It's undeniable as to what he believes. But Daniel 9 confined the taking away of Israel's sin to the 70 weeks of Daniel. That's undeniable. And Chris even admitted, in response to my written questions, Daniel's 70 weeks were completed in the first century.
Now, does he believe that they were fulfilled by AD 35 or AD 70? When is he placing?
He did not clarify, and he did not specify.
Gotcha.
Really doesn't matter. And of course, if he took the 33 to 35 position of the end of the 70 weeks, then you've got the putting away of Israel's sin by that time. And yet Paul, writing in 57 AD in Romans chapter 11, is still taking or looking forward to the taking away of their sin at the coming of the Lord. So, you know, the AD 33 to 35 posit just simply will not work.
And you have the revelatory gifts that are supposed to form the New Testament as ceasing before the New Testament documents are being written. So
yeah, exactly. Which, by the way, as a diversion here, not a diversion, but a slight caveat, Kenneth Gentry, when interacting with Gruden, made the comment in a footnote, it may very well be that seal up vision and prophecy is the cessation of prophecy. Okay, and the fulfillment of prophecy. Well, I'm pretty sure he saw the train coming after that because that locked him into, instead of being an AD 70 preterist, it locked him into becoming an AD 33 preterist. And so in his later writings, he recanted very subtly, but he recanted that. But anyway, go back up to the charts. I want to show everyone what previous charts. That's number, what was it? Yeah. Okay. I made point of this twice. I didn't get one single word. And, you know, I like to watch my opponent's faces when I make points. He didn't know what to do with this. And that's why he did the Passover on it. Right. So the resurrection is at the coming of the Lord for the salvation of Israel. Scripture is clear on that. And Chris Date agrees. That is his stated position repeatedly. Okay. But that coming of the Lord for the salvation of Israel would be in fulfillment of God's covenant with Israel. Isaiah 59, Romans 11:27, which quotes Isaiah 59, in which Paul, speaking of the coming of the Lord for the salvation of Israel, it would be, quote, this is my covenant with them when I take away their sin, unquote. Well, okay, if the coming of the Lord for the salvation of Israel would be in fulfillment of God's covenant with Israel, then that covenant with Israel stands valid until that coming of the Lord for the salvation of Israel. It's undeniable, it's unequivocal, and it's irrefutable. So that raised the question, does Chris Date believe that God has one covenant for Old Covenant Israel, still in effect, still binding, and another covenant for the church?
Now, we saw a weak spot here when Chris was moderating the debate between Steve Gregg and Michael Brown, where he was saying, oh, but Michael Brown, I agree with you over here on national Israel. Yeah. And oh, Steve, I kind of agree with you over here. But what he was agreeing with Michael Brown was curious, claiming to be an all-millennialist. And I could tell that was going to be a problem for him. And when I saw your opening here, I'm like, he's probably not, he is not equipped to deal with it because he's never thought of it. Within futurism, you don't have to think about this.
Right.
Because you can do that. Well, I kind of agree with the premillennialists here, and I kind of, but you're not forced to really look at the logic of when the covenant ends, and if there are two covenant peoples, it just
doesn't register. And look, I can empathize with that to a certain extent because, like I was raised, I've said many times, I was raised a fifth generation all-millennialist. I never saw the connection between God's covenant with Israel and eschatology. It was just like, it wasn't even
until you wanted to debate a premillennialist and started looking at Romans 11.
Yeah, exactly.
Then you began thinking about it, going, "Uh-oh."
Well, you are exactly right. It's like, uh-oh, I got a problem here. I got to figure this out. And see, that's what it goes back to, that saying, iron sharpens steel, right? You are forced, when you are in these kind of discussions, whether they're formal or informal, you are forced to say, oh, wow, I never thought about that connection before. And so, absolutely right. And I'll guarantee you, Chris Day, let's go to the next chart here. I think it's the next one. Yeah, in which I asked, why discuss Israel? Well, as you pointed out, Chris Day, in the debate between Michael Brown and Steve Gregg, pardon me, boy, my voice is still weak from the debate. And it hasn't helped that I'm at swap meet talking to all these car guys, so my voice is very, very weak. And so in that debate, he said that he agreed with Dr. Brown of a future restoration of Israel. Okay. Here's the interesting thing, folks. In the written questions to Chris Date, I asked him, are your eschatological hopes based upon and taken from God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel? His initial sentence or two was, no, my eschatological hope is based upon both the Old Testament and the New. And then he turned right around in the same paragraph, Mike, and said, now to specifically answer your question, I would answer in the negative. No, he's saying, no, my eschatological hope is not based upon and taken from God's Old Covenant promises to Israel.
Wow.
Okay. Yeah. I'm sorry, folks. This is a massive, massive problem. Why? Well, because Paul said resurrection was the hope of Israel. What passages? Look, I remember struggling with this years and years and years ago. And a real quick anecdote. I don't want to take up too much time. In one of my very first debates as a full preterist, I asked my Church of Christ opponent, are your eschatological hopes based upon the yet future fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel? Now, you have to remember, folks, that in the churches of Christ, one of the most fundamental doctrines is God was through with Old Covenant Israel at the cross. God took the Old Covenant away at the cross. So I handed the written questions to my opponent. He was supposed to hand them back before I got up to make my first presentation, and he didn't do it. And I sent William over to his table. I said, William, he's got to give him the answers. And he acted like he couldn't find them. It was hilarious.
Wow.
It was absolutely hilarious. He was looking around. I don't know where. And William said, they're right there. Yeah. William can be a little imposing.
He's a big guy.
So I looked at that specific question, and out beside the question, he had put great, great, big, bold, capital letters, underlined it 3 times, and put 3 exclamation points out beside it in quotation marks.
No.
Correct. No. Well, I got up and I repeated the question. I said, now my opponent says his hope of the resurrection, judgment, coming of the Lord is not based on the Old Testament. I used the very same text, folks, catch this, the very same text that Chris Date, when he talks about his resurrection hope, these are the verses that Paul quotes. Isaiah 25:8, Hosea 13, Daniel 12, Isaiah 27. So if Chris Date appeals to 1 Corinthians 15, 54, and 54 through 56, as he does, and if Paul's resurrection hope is taken from these Old Testament passages, and by the way, in every speech on eschatology that I've heard on the internet, that I've heard Chris give, guess what he does? Paul's quoting from Isaiah 25:8, from Hosea chapter 13, from Daniel chapter 12. So he admits it in his presentations when he's not debating a preterist.
And when he just wants to cite it and not actually exegete Isaiah 25 or 27 or 26 or Daniel 12, it sounds good. I mean, great, Chris, you can rattle off some scriptures that are related, but we can't exegete the scripture that are related.
That's exactly right. And so I had this chart, folks. Now look at this quote. This is from one of the most foreknown scholars of the day, an incredibly wonderful book, Tribulation in the End, Jesus, Tribulation in the End of Exile. Good luck finding a copy of that, by the way. But nonetheless, commenting on Daniel chapter 12, he said, this passage, like all resurrection texts in the Old Testament, is also a prophecy of the restoration of Israel, unquote. Now, by the way, he is not saying anything different from John Levinson, Scott McKnight, N.T. Wright, Tom Holland. They all say this to some varying degrees. So it's not like, as a full preterist, I'm just making this up out of the clear blue sky. These are some of the foremost, I'll use the term, quote, conservative scholars in the world today. And yet they're recognizing that every single one of these Old Testament prophecies was initially a prophecy of the restoration of corporate Israel out of sin debt, out of exile, out of separation from God. And it was a promise of the restoration to the presence of God. In other words,
to the land would be a resurrection.
Exactly.
So you guys did get into Hebrews a little bit, but of course, everything that's better or true in Hebrews is always spiritual.
Absolutely.
It's related to the new covenant every single time, without exception. So now once we get into Hebrews 11:39 and that whole chapter, somehow the better resurrection, Chris has a better physical resurrection. Exactly. And now to your point here, then we have to go to Hebrews 13:14, which I think it's the Smith's literal translation that translates mellow there as about to be. We don't have a city here that is eternal or enduring, but we look to the one that is about to come.
I believe Scott McKnight renders it as about to come, does he not?
I don't know, but either way, when we're talking about restoration of a city, and of course Hebrews talks about a better land, a heavenly land as spiritual. So we got a spiritual land, we have a spiritual city connected to the time statements that are inseparably connected to the better resurrection, as this quote here is pointing out. Yes. Restoration of the land and coming back into the land. You cannot separate that, just like you can't separate the tribulation from the time of the resurrection. And so when you're making these inseparable connections, all he's going to do is mock you as doing this and that, but you're making the legitimate connections.
Yeah, and I thought it was very telling. And again, I was trying to watch the body language, and I thought it was very telling. He did his best to deflect from it, but when he appealed to Hebrews chapter 11 and said, well, women receive their dead back, and they look for a better resurrection. And I made the point, yeah, they were looking for something better than physical resurrection.
Right. That's what I was like, dude. He says, see, he gets all into the Greek here, physical resurrection. But Chris, he's not talking about that now. He's talking about something that's better. Right. And he
literally did the Passover on it. He tried to mock it a little bit, but he basically did the Passover on it. He had no response to that. And to me, it's so clear in Hebrews chapter 11, 36 and following, that the better resurrection is absolutely better than receiving someone back from the dead, physical death. And of course, his attempt at that was saying, well, yeah, but they received their loved ones back from physical death only to die again. But now they're looking for the better resurrection in which they won't die physically again. Well, that sounds good, but he has to prove it.
Right.
And there's nothing in the text that indicates that. And as you at the point that you were making there, the point of fact is everything in Hebrews chapter 11 is the better things, including the better resurrection, is spiritual. It's not physical, it's spiritual.
Yeah, it's like to be consistent with Chris's mentality there, he would have to say everything else that's better in Hebrews is half physical, half spiritual. So we look forward to a better temple that's going to be kind of physical, kind of spiritual, because that's how he's interpreting a better resurrection. It's we've got our physical body back, but we also are filled with the Spirit, and it's kind of a spiritual, physical body. But the author of Hebrews knows nothing of that.
Nothing. Oh, I've just got to bring this up. Both in his debate with Michael Miano, and he wrote a paper on resurrection being physical yet spiritual. And I've got to tell you, I just thought to myself, he has destroyed himself. Here's what he said in regard to the Greek word psychikos. And in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 44, Paul says it, which is, quote, the body, it is the soma, is sown a natural body, psychikos. It, the body, is raised a spiritual, pneuma. Well, here's what Chris says about the word psychikos and pneuma. These words seldom, if ever, refer to any biological substance. They have nothing to do with somatic substance. They have to do with a way of life characterized by rebellion against God. Now, that's not a quote, but that's the gist of what he was trying to say. So the natural man is unregenerate man, unconverted man.
Yeah, and he even said guilty of sins like gluttony, and I was like, okay, I'm not going to go there, but that's how he defined. Am I not right? That's how he defined.
That's how he defined the natural man. That's exactly right.
But they're kind of stuck, aren't they? Because we've pressed this whole natural spiritual in 1 Corinthians 15. So now they don't really know what to do. So they're trying to I agree with you that natural doesn't necessarily have to be physical, and spiritual doesn't have to be totally spiritual. It can be kind of physical. And it's like, you have no idea what they're trying to say.
No, I mean, it really is a word salad.
Yeah.
Okay. So when I pressed him on his own use of natural man, that it's not biological substance, I don't know if you caught it, Mike. Of course, you weren't as familiar with, you hadn't been studying his definition of psychikos and what have you, like I had been. So on the one hand, he was absolutely denying that psychikos referred to a biological body. It was not a body. Well, when I pointed out, since it's not a biological body, here is Paul saying, well, it is a body. It's somebody.
And it's going into the ground. And here you say it's a body going into the ground.
That's right. You got something that's not even a body, according to him. And yet Paul says it, which is the body, going into the ground. And I pointed out, well, okay, wait a minute. The natural man, and this is straight from Chris Day, and it's straight from Paul. Natural man cannot receive the things of God, for their foolishness to him, neither can he receive them. Okay, Paul said the natural man goes into the ground, is sown. That's physical death, physical burial, according to Chris Day. It is raised a spiritual man. So the question that I posed to Chris and the argument that I posed in the debate, folks, and I raised it twice. Okay. Now, time was pressing. You may not have caught it. But I said, how does the reprobate man, how does the unregenerate man get regenerated in the dirt? Because it's sown natural, it's raised spiritual.
Spiritual, right?
I don't know if you noticed the 180-degree change. That, I mean, this was basically a debate conversion. And I'm sitting there going, holy cow, I don't have time to respond to that. He said, the difference, Don, is that in 1 Corinthians 15:44, it's the body. What? After telling us in his article it's not a body,
Right.
after in his debate with Michael saying the natural man is not the body, now in his debate with me when he's trapped by it, oh, it's the body, Don. That's a body in 1 Corinthians 15:44. Well, what kind of body is it?
Well, then it comes out of spiritual body. If the natural is physical and it's the physical body, then what's the spiritual body then, Chris?
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, we do have someone here that has quoted Chris. This is what Chris has said. He says, I don't think I was as well prepared for today's debate as I should have been. And I'm not satisfied by my answers to some of Don's questions. I pray for forgiveness from God and his people. Thankfully, I think my opening case emerged unscathed. All it was Roman Catholic. I want to get into that because I would have answered his argument much differently than you did. But he says, thankfully, my opening case emerged unscathed. We can indeed expect to rise back physically to life in the future forever. Okay, well, you just assumed what you didn't prove, but at least I think he's seen a lot of people are calling him out on the carpet like, dude, it's just clear as day. You did not answer this man's affirmatives.
Yep.
And you had a meme to do it.
Exactly right.
So you want to finish your thought before I hope I didn't interrupt you, but.
Well, my point is that he did a 180 change on the significance, on the definition of natural versus spiritual. In the first place, and listen, in the article, and I have it laying on my desk at the house, no less than 3 straight times, he said psuchikos and pneumatikos, and I can't hardly pronounce pneumakos. But anyway, 3 times, and it may be actually 4, he says these words are not related to biological substance. They're not related to a physical body. They're talking about the man in relation to God. Well, how are you, Chris Date, in your paradigm going to divide them then? Right. I mean, he's got a really serious problem here. Yeah. And when he said, Don, the difference then in 1 Corinthians 54 is talking about the body. That's a recantation of everything that he said in his debate with Michael Miano and that he said in his article. He just abandoned everything that he had argued.
Yeah. Let's talk about real quick, John chapter 11. He says, well, it's saying that those who died, they're going to be raised, and the living are if they believe in him, they'll never die. It's like, Chris, it says those who believe in him will never die. It does not say they believe on him, they're going to die for thousands of years, millions of years, and then they're going to rise physically, and that's when they will never die. The text does not say that. He's just read all of that into that simple phrase. And this is a problem for Ed Stevens and my physical, literal rapture friends. I challenge them on this all the time. What does it mean when Jesus says in John 8, John 11, if you believe in my word, believe in me, you will never die? Well, the rapturist, I pressed Ed on this, and I said, if you're going to be consistent with this order, the dead and then the living, Thessalonians, dead and living, 1 Corinthians 15, you're going to have to say that this passage is talking about the physical rapture. And I waited a few days, and he came back and he said, I think it is. I'm like, then I start. That's when I saw. That's when the lights came on, and I'm like, oh, this is a joke. Because if Jesus says, if you believe in me, you'll never thirst. Jesus says, if you believe on me, you will never go hungry. Now, if we're going to be consistent, what these folks are saying, whether it's a physical rapture view or a physical resurrection view, anywhere you want to put it, if you're going to be consistent with those three phrases, never die, never go hungry, never go thirsty, what you're saying is you're going to be raised physically, go to heaven, and to maintain your physical body, resurrected body forever, God's going to give you physical food and physical drink to maintain that physical, spiritual resurrection you have, which is a joke because once you point out, what did Jesus mean when he says, if you believe in me, you'll never thirst? They see, oh, that's abundant life.
Yeah.
Right. But if you equate it to never die, then they see the train coming and go, it's got nothing to do with physical body.
Yeah, we're almost out of time here, but I was giving us a presentation at Red Boiling Springs, Kentucky, years ago. After it was over, a gentleman came up. He was in his 80s, he told me. I think 85.
Yeah, I remember this.
You remember this? And the guy says, well, I agree with a lot you said, but he said, you just didn't tell the truth. And I said, what are you talking about? He said, well, Jesus said, if you believe in me, you'll never die. And I said, well, that's right. But I said, he wasn't talking about physical death. He said, yes, he was. And I said, how? No. And he said, no, I'm never going to die. I said, wait a minute. Are you talking physical death? He said, I absolutely am. And I with all kindness, as kindly as I could, sir, how old are you? And that's what he told me. He was in his mid-80s. And I said, with all due respect, sir, you're going to die physically. And he said, no, I am not. I believe in Jesus, and I'm never going to die physically.
Yeah.
Okay, well, you've got a problem there. There's a 100% death rate in the world.
Two quick points I want to make before we close.
Yeah.
Because other than avoiding all of your affirmative arguments, Chris's main point, other than Romans 6, which we can get into in a minute if we have time, there's other 2 points were church tradition. And I'm sitting here thinking, and I brought this up immediately in the comments during the debate. I said, wait a second, Chris, you don't believe in eternal conscious torment.
That's right.
When did this come around? When did the creeds affirm this? All right. Number 2, the Holy Spirit's failed if this position's true. Okay, Chris, when did the doctrine of forensic justification start?
I wanted to bring that up so bad.
I know, I kept waiting. I was like, God. But I think that way constantly because I'm always debating reformers, right?
Sure.
And so what they try and do, some of them, most of them will admit that. And if they admit it, it's over because now we're talking about 300 years, 200 years. So if the Holy Spirit didn't fail for 1500 years until this new doctrine showed up, then why are you saying a couple hundred years? And I don't even give them that ground because I show them the difference between the amillennial and the partial preterist is already formed full preterism. But granted, if that's true, then how do you square it with this? And they can't. Now, some of them will say, well, some of these early church fathers kind of had a little bit here and there of the doctrine of forensic justification. But when you look at their writings, the people they quote, that quote might seem to teach that, but you'll find another quote where they're blurring sanctification and justification, especially with the sacraments, because they were real big in transubstantiation and other things. So, so it's just not there. So those arguments fall on their face completely.
Well, I agree. And I thought that the response that I gave, well, if the Holy Spirit, if his response to my argument on the great apostasy, for instance, demanded that the Holy Spirit failed, and I challenged him on this like twice. Well, if that's true, then did the Holy Spirit fail at the church at Corinth? Because look at the apostasy that was rampant at the church at Corinth. What about the churches in Galatia, the whole region that Paul said they had departed from the faith? What about the Luke chapter 18? When the Son of Man comes, will he even find faith on the earth? And this is another area in which Chris tried desperately to deflect and tried to misrepresent me. He said, well, it doesn't say every single person. I never claimed
Yeah,
every single
I know.
person.
I caught that too.
Yeah, I said it says the majority. I never said every person. And I said, what is the majority? Well, it's not the minority, it's the majority, and that's all that I'm claiming. And if you'll notice, he accused me of boy, he really seemed to get upset about Luke chapter 18. But I said, if Chris takes Luke chapter 18 as predictive of the second coming of Christ, I never said that. I never said that. I said, Chris, I said, if you take it that way,
Right. Yeah.
then what does that mean? It means that at the time of the second coming, the apostasy would be so massive that Jesus said, when the Son of Man comes, will he even find faith? Well, it's therefore, and time got away from me. If it's true concerning the second coming, it would also be true of AD 70.
Yes.
An apostasy so big that Jesus had to ponder, would anyone be left? And that brings that question up. Okay, in what way did the Holy Spirit fail then, whether it's in AD 70 or if you're going to posit these passages at the future time? Are you going to admit, oh, well, my position demands that the Holy Spirit fails so radically that Jesus would say, well, I don't even know if there'll be anybody of faith alive when I come.
Yeah. And it doesn't matter if tomorrow we find some scroll in a cave of some early church Christians that said the second coming happened when the temple fell. Use those exact words. All these guys would do is they'd go, oh no, and then they would go, well, I guess hyperpreterism started a little bit earlier in church history than we think. Like, to make this like the end all argument, and yet it's really.
Or they would come up and say, well, yeah, but we don't know who that was. They have no credibility.
Right.
And by the way, they're violating the patristics and the creeds. So therefore, we can't accept their testimony.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we're running out of time, but Romans 6, that was his that was his big thing, other than it's not found in church history. That he thought he had something there that was a bone he wasn't going to let go. Folks, all you have to do is read Romans 6, 4 through 10. Christ died once to sin. And just like Don said, if physical resurrection is there, it's in the background because it's not how he's applying it to the Roman believers. He's saying that their likeness related to Christ's death on the cross had to do with them being united to Christ, who died to sin. And therefore, their resurrection likeness to Christ has to do with Christ being in the Father's presence. Resurrection from death, presence to God. Resurrection. That's the life, that's the death and the life that is being talked about in Romans chapter 6. And
he literally would not touch what I pointed out. If the likeness of his resurrection, his physical resurrection, then buried with him in the likeness of his death, demands physical death.
Yeah.
He wouldn't touch it.
Paul doesn't say eventually it's going to be applied to the physical. You see how many things you have to read into the text.
Everything.
Everything.
You've got to read everything into it. Yeah. Hey, man, we're out of time.
Yeah. Well, is Jan around? Are you going to get something to eat?
I'm going to go get something to eat. She didn't feel like coming.
Oh,
and, and so I'm on my own. And there is a wonderful, wonderful restaurant here in Duncan, Oklahoma called Wright's. It's on the other side of town, but Duncan's this big, so it's not a big deal. And so they have a smorgasbord, sort of kind of a bar that goes along with your meal when you order a steak or any of their main entrees. And I mean, they have boiled cabbage, they have homegrown green beans, they have brown beans. I mean, a guy could OD just on their little bar. And then when you add that to their roast beef is to die for. And I mean, they just heap it up on the plate, So,
well, good. You tear it up, Tiger. Go get you some good food. And I feel bad for you that it didn't go well, but because it didn't go well, it did go well.
That's exactly right.
That's how you have to look at it.
I have to tell you, I'm extremely pleased and humbled by so many comments, and you know that I pride myself on trying to be a gentleman in the debates. That's kind of a trademark, and Zach Davis commented on it in his review, and so many others of the ones that I read commented on that. I I'm a firm believer in being what Paul said in 2 Timothy chapter 2, 24 and following. The child of God must not strive, but be gentle toward all men, and gentleness in treating them, et cetera, et cetera. And there has never been a debate in which I have lost my cool, in which I have called my opponent names, in which I've tried to insult them. Now, debate is a time, at times, for some very plain speech, but never in rancor, never in anger. And so it's always gratifying to me and humbling when even the opponents, even those who side with the other guy, come back and say, well, I might not agree with Preston, but he's a true gentleman, etc. And Mike, I don't know if you saw the comments or not. There were at least 2 comments by people who believe like Chris, but they said, Chris Date lost this debate hands down.
Yeah.
That's pretty telling. Pretty telling.
Well, I've never seen a debate that you haven't won hands down, my friend. All right. Well, we will see you next week. And I don't know if we finished this review. If not, we will get back into Deuteronomy 32. So
yeah, we'll have to talk about, see what we want to do next week.
All right, man.
All right. Good night,
my friend. Thank you, everybody.
That I may walk before my God in the light, in the light, in the light of life, 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 in the